Outstanding King S. Guard shouts AT tourist cross prohibited. This was a city known for its royal heritage, centuries-old traditions, and stunning landmarks. The air smelled fresh, and the sound of footsteps echoed along the cobbled streets as people eagerly made their way towards the castle gates. As visitors streamed past, many couldn't help but be drawn to the king's guards stationed at the entrance. These guards, dressed in their striking uniforms, were an essential part of the country's history. They stood tall, their uniforms gleaming in the morning light, and their faces were a picture of seriousness and discipline. Their role, while ceremonial, was deeply rooted in centuries of tradition, and they were known for their unwavering focus and stoic presence. Every single detail about them was calculated, from the way they held their stance to the way they moved, or rather, how they didn't move. They were a living piece of history, symbolizing the strength and pride of the country. Among the crowd, a tourist named Julia stood out. She was an avid traveler, always looking for new experiences. Julia had visited many places before, but this time, there was something different about her journey. She was fascinated by the rich history of the country and had eagerly planned her visit to the royal castle. As she walked through the gate, she marveled at the grandeur of the architecture, the massive stone walls that seemed to tell tales of battles fought and kingdoms lost. She couldn't help but take pictures of everything: the intricate carvings on the door frames, the tall towers that stretched into the sky, and of course, the imposing figure of the king's guard standing silently at attention. Her excitement was palpable. Julia had seen these guards in movies and heard stories about them, but being so close to one felt surreal. She pulled out her camera, eager to capture the moment. As she zoomed in to take a shot, she stepped a little too close to one of the guards, not fully realizing the significance of the space between them. It wasn't intentional. She was simply caught up in the magic of the moment. She was unaware of the fact that the guard, as a symbol of the country's traditions, was more than just a person standing there. To Julia, he was part of the castle's grandeur, a living statue that she wanted to photograph. As she adjusted her camera settings and prepared for the perfect shot, she heard a sharp voice that immediately broke her concentration. "Step back," the voice commanded firmly, cutting through the hum of the crowd. Julia froze, her heart skipped a beat, and her eyes widened in surprise. She looked up from her camera and saw the guard's cold, piercing eyes locked on hers. There was no warmth in his expression, just an unyielding stare that demanded respect. He hadn't moved a muscle, but his voice was filled with authority, a stark reminder of his position. Julia blinked, trying to make sense of what had just happened. She didn't fully understand why the guard had spoken to her that way. She had seen other people around her snap pictures and stand close to the guards, smiling and joking. Why had she been singled out? She instinctively took a step back, but the confusion lingered. She wasn't sure whether she had done something wrong or if this was just part of the guard's strict demeanor. The crowd around her started to murmur. Some tourists turned their heads, curious about the interaction, while others laughed nervously. There were a few whispers about how serious the guards could be, and some people seemed to make light of the situation, thinking Julia had simply stepped out of line. But Julia, feeling a sense of embarrassment creeping over her, wasn't so sure. Her heart raced as she tried to process what had just happened. Had she crossed an invisible boundary? In the back of her mind, Julia remembered reading somewhere that the guards weren't just ceremonial figures. They were soldiers with a very real and important duty. They weren't there for the tourists' entertainment, but rather as a symbol of the country's history, discipline, and pride. Julia quickly realized that her seemingly innocent mistake might have been more serious than she first thought. As she stood there, the guard remained unmoving. His face was a mask of professionalism, and he didn't offer any explanation for his actions. It wasn't his job to explain anything to the tourists. His role was to uphold tradition, and to do so with an unwavering commitment. His focus was entirely on the task at hand, maintaining the sacred responsibility that had been passed down to him from countless generations. Julia took another step back, her mind racing. She wasn't sure whether to apologize, but she didn't want to make the situation worse. The last thing she wanted was to be seen as disrespectful in front of all the other tourists. She simply wanted to learn and experience the culture, not offend anyone. The moment seemed to stretch on forever. Julia glanced around, trying to gauge the reactions of those nearby. Some looked at her sympathetically, while others seemed to shrug it off, thinking it was just a minor misunderstanding. But to Julia, it felt like much more. She felt like an outsider who had unknowingly disrupted a long-standing tradition. The guard, however, gave no sign that he was bothered by her confusion. He simply returned to his original stance, his eyes fixed ahead, and his posture as rigid as ever. At that moment, something shifted in Julia's mind. She realized that there was something deeper at play here, something more than just a simple misunderstanding. The guard's actions weren't personal. They were part of a larger system of tradition and respect. In this world, there were rules that had been in place for centuries, and for them to be respected, they needed to be followed without question. Julia wasn't just a tourist who had made a mistake. She had inadvertently encountered a moment of cultural significance. It wasn't about the guard's anger or frustration. It was about the integrity of an institution that had stood the test of time. As she stepped back, taking a deep breath, she tried to internalize the lesson she was being taught. There were boundaries, invisible lines that had been drawn long before she arrived. And just like that, she understood the seriousness of the situation. The tourists around her continued with their own pictures, some still laughing nervously, others whispering among themselves. But for Julia, the moment would stay with her far longer than the fleeting snapshots of the castle she had taken. It was a moment of realization, of stepping into a world where respect for history, culture, and tradition mattered more than anything else. Julia took a deep breath, feeling her face flush with a mix of confusion and embarrassment. The sharpness in the guard's voice still echoed in her ears, making her acutely aware of how much she had unknowingly disturbed the quiet discipline of the moment. She glanced around quickly, hoping to find some explanation in the faces of the other tourists, but most of them had already returned to their own activities. Some still stole glances at her, but none seemed to offer any help in understanding what had just happened. She hesitated, standing there in the middle of the crowd, feeling like the center of attention. The guard remained as still as a statue, his eyes fixed ahead, his face unreadable. He had issued the command with such authority, as though there was no room for negotiation or discussion. It was clear that he wasn't bothered by Julia's actions, but instead, he was simply carrying out his duty, a duty that, as Julia now realized, wasn't just about standing guard in front of the castle gates. The surrounding atmosphere had shifted. What had started as a simple visit to a famous historical landmark now felt like an unspoken lesson in respect, one that Julia hadn't expected to receive. It wasn't just about photography or taking a step too close. There was something much bigger at play. This wasn't just a momentary lapse in social etiquette. It was a clash of cultures, a misunderstanding of the seriousness with which certain traditions were upheld. Julia shifted uncomfortably on her feet. She wasn't sure whether to apologize, step away entirely, or try to explain that she hadn't meant to cross any boundaries. But how could she explain herself? She didn't fully understand the rules of this world, of the kingdom, the guard's role, or the significance of the traditions they represented. She had only read about it in books, seen it in movies, or heard stories from other travelers. But being here in the midst of it all was completely different. She was an outsider, caught off guard by an unspoken line that she had unknowingly crossed. The tourists around her continued to take pictures, posing in front of the grand castle gates, blissfully unaware of the subtle tension that had momentarily swept through the scene. To them, it was just another stop on a long list of travel destinations. But to Julia, it had turned into a sobering reminder of how deeply ingrained respect for culture and tradition could be. The guard hadn't moved an inch since he spoke. His stance was as rigid and as unmoving as a statue, but Julia couldn't help but wonder what he was thinking. Was he annoyed by her proximity? Did he feel irritated that she hadn't known the proper distance to maintain? Or was he simply going through the motions, performing a duty that had been instilled in him for years? She couldn't tell. His face remained as expressionless as ever, but there was something about the stillness in his presence that suggested he was more than just a soldier doing his job. There was a sense of history in his every movement, a sense of weight in his responsibility that Julia hadn't fully appreciated before this moment. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that the guard wasn't just following orders. His position, his uniform, his unwavering posture, they were all symbols of something much bigger. This wasn't just about standing still or protecting a palace. This was about carrying the legacy of countless generations, ensuring that the traditions of the past were upheld for future generations. To him, the castle wasn't just a building, it was a sacred place, a symbol of the country's strength, and the guard was its protector. Julia tried to put herself in his shoes. She thought about what it must be like to stand at attention for hours, day after day, in the same place, doing the same thing with no room for error. How difficult it must be to maintain that level of focus, to remain so still and unwavering in the face of constant distraction. As she thought about this, she began to understand. It wasn't about her, and it certainly wasn't about a simple mistake or misunderstanding. The guard was simply carrying out his duty to the best of his ability. His focus, his stern demeanor, was a reflection of how seriously he took that duty. Julia had learned, through this brief encounter, that in some places, duty wasn't just about the job, it was about preserving the honor and history of a nation. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had somehow disrespected the guard or the castle. She had only been trying to capture a photo, to preserve a memory of this incredible place. But in doing so, she had unknowingly violated an unspoken rule. The guard had only done what was expected of him, nothing more, nothing less. With a nervous glance toward the guard, Julia slowly took another step back. She wasn't sure if he was still watching her, but she could feel his presence, like a force field surrounding him. Every movement felt measured, deliberate. Julia wanted to step away gracefully, to show that she had learned her lesson, but her body felt heavy with embarrassment. Her mind raced with thoughts of whether others had noticed, if they were judging her for her mistake. For a moment, she stood there in silence, caught between the desire to understand and the discomfort of the situation. The tourists who had been around her earlier had now moved on, leaving her standing alone in front of the guard. The castle loomed over her, its ancient stone walls seeming to grow taller with each passing second. The weight of the moment pressed down on her shoulders, reminding her that she was not just a tourist in a foreign land. She was a guest in a place where history, culture, and tradition were sacred. Julia let out a slow breath. The anxiety that had gripped her began to ease, and she started to feel a shift in her perspective. She hadn't meant to offend the guard or disrespect the traditions he represented. In fact, she had come to learn and appreciate the culture, and yet she had stumbled into a moment of misunderstanding. But perhaps, in some way, this was part of her journey, to encounter moments like these, to grow from them, and to learn more than just the surface-level beauty of a place. She took another cautious step back, this time with more confidence. The guard, as if he had sensed her shift in energy, remained as still as ever, his gaze forward. The silence between them was no longer tense, but instead felt like an unspoken understanding. She wasn't just a tourist taking photos anymore. She was someone who had learned something invaluable about respect, duty, and tradition. With one last look at the guard, Julia slowly made her way toward the exit, her thoughts deep in reflection. She understood now, in a way that she hadn't before, the importance of respecting the boundaries set by others. And while her encounter with the guard might have started as a simple misunderstanding, it had ended up teaching her something far more meaningful than any photograph could. Julia walked away from the guard, her heart still racing, but a little lighter than before. The air felt fresher now, less heavy with embarrassment. The crowd around her continued to buzz with energy, a mix of excitement and curiosity. Tourists chattered, snapped pictures, and eagerly walked toward the gates of the castle, unaware of the tension that had just unfolded in the small corner of the courtyard. To them, the day was simply another part of their travel experience. But for Julia, this moment had taken on a much deeper meaning. She couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. It wasn't just a simple mistake. It was a moment of realization, one that had shifted her perspective in a way she hadn't expected. She had come to this country to explore its history, to learn about its culture and traditions, but now she had learned a much more personal lesson: the importance of respect, respect for the space of others, for the rules of the place, and for the history that shaped it all. As Julia walked a few steps away, her eyes wandered back toward the guard. He still stood there, perfectly still, as though nothing had happened. His expression was unchanged, his eyes fixed on the horizon. To anyone else, he would have looked like a statue, unmoving and unbothered. But Julia now understood the purpose behind that stillness. It wasn't just about standing guard. It was about embodying the weight of history, upholding the traditions of a country that had been built over centuries. The guard wasn't just protecting the castle, he was protecting something much more significant: the legacy of the nation itself. Julia couldn't help but wonder what the people around her thought of the incident. As she moved toward the edge of the courtyard, she overheard snippets of conversations. A few tourists had noticed the exchange and were talking about it. Some were laughing it off, as if it had been a harmless misunderstanding, while others seemed more serious. "You really have to be careful around the guards," one woman said to her friend. "They take their duties very seriously." Julia nodded quietly to herself. The words echoed in her mind, confirming what she had come to understand. The guard's actions weren't personal. They were simply a reflection of his duty, his commitment to upholding the sacredness of the place. Julia's mistake hadn't been a simple one. It was a failure to recognize the deeper significance of the guard's presence. It was more than just a man in a uniform. It was a symbol of the country's strength, its pride, and its past. Despite her initial embarrassment, Julia found herself grateful for the experience. She had learned something important, something that no guidebook or travel brochure could have taught her. It wasn't just about taking pictures or capturing memories. It was about learning how to be respectful of the spaces you entered and the people you encountered. It was about understanding that every culture had its own unique ways of honoring tradition and history, and sometimes those ways weren't immediately obvious. As she continued to walk away from the castle, her mind began to shift from the uncomfortable moment she had just experienced to a broader understanding of the world around her. This was part of the journey, wasn't it? To step outside of your comfort zone, to make mistakes, and to learn from them. The world was full of different rules, different customs, and sometimes those differences could be jarring. But that was also what made travel so enriching. It wasn't just about sightseeing. It was about gaining a deeper appreciation for the way other people lived, the way they honored their past, and the way they maintained their traditions. Julia's eyes scanned the bustling courtyard, where tourists from all over the world were milling about. Each person seemed to be caught up in their own little bubble, their own version of the experience. Some were laughing with friends, others were talking animatedly with tour guides, while a few stood silently, taking in the beauty of the castle. Everyone had their own way of connecting with the place, But Julia realized that not everyone would understand the significance of the guard's role. Some might see him as just another part of the show, another element to photograph for their travel scrapbook. But to her, he had become a living symbol of something far deeper, something that could not be captured in a photograph. She paused, standing at the edge of the courtyard, and took a deep breath. The cool breeze felt refreshing against her skin. It wasn't just the landscape around her that had changed, it was her own perspective. She was no longer just a tourist here. She was someone who had gained a glimpse into a culture that valued history and tradition in ways that she hadn't fully appreciated before. She turned to look back at the guard one last time. His posture remained perfect, his gaze unwavering. It was as though nothing could shake him, nothing could interrupt the flow of time and tradition that he stood to protect. Julia felt a sense of awe in that moment, not for the guard himself, but for the role he played in the larger story of the country. He wasn't just a person standing still. He was a link between the past and the present, a living testament to the dedication and sacrifice of those who had come before him. The tourists around her continued to enjoy their day, snapping photos and laughing, but Julia's mind had shifted. She was no longer focused on the superficial aspects of the experience. She was focused on the meaning beneath it all, the deeper connection to the culture, to the traditions that had been passed down through generations. As she made her way through the castle grounds, she passed by several other guards standing in their stations, each one just as still and imposing as the last. This time, she didn't feel the urge to take a photo or get closer. Instead, she felt a quiet respect for what they represented. These weren't just people in uniforms. They were symbols of something far greater, something that had been carefully preserved for centuries. Julia reflected on how easy it had been to overlook the significance of these traditions before she had her own encounter. Before, she had been so caught up in the excitement of her travels, so eager to snap pictures and check things off her list, that she hadn't truly seen the depth of the places she visited. But now, after the encounter with the guard, she understood that there was so much more to every destination. There was history in every stone, every building, and every tradition that seemed simple on the surface but carried layers of meaning and significance. As the day wore on, Julia moved through the castle grounds, feeling a sense of peace and quiet understanding. The guard's actions had served as a reminder to her, one that she would carry with her for the rest of her journey. It wasn't just about visiting places and taking photos. It was about connecting with the heart of a place, respecting its history, and honoring the people who preserved that history. And that, she realized, was the true meaning of travel. Julia continued walking, her thoughts swirling around the encounter with the guard. The more she thought about it, the more she realized how little she had understood about the deep significance of the traditions here. She had arrived expecting to see beautiful buildings, take some photos, and maybe learn a little about the history. But this experience with the guard had taught her something far more valuable: how easily she could overlook the essence of a place when she was too focused on herself and her own journey. As she walked further into the castle grounds, she saw people still enjoying the beautiful surroundings. Some were sitting on benches, chatting in small groups, while others were taking pictures of the impressive architecture. But Julia, who had once been just like them, now found herself seeing the place in a new light. It wasn't just a tourist attraction. It was a living piece of history, full of meaning and purpose. The sunlight streamed through the tall trees lining the pathway, casting long shadows on the ground. The air smelled crisp, filled with the scent of flowers and the earth. Julia walked slowly, her mind still preoccupied with the guard. She realized that she hadn't fully appreciated the depth of what he represented. He wasn't just a person standing guard for no reason. He was part of a long-standing tradition, and in his stillness and discipline, he was preserving something much larger than himself. He was part of the history of the kingdom, and that made him more than just a figure in a uniform. He was a living connection to the past. Julia had never considered that before. She had always been so caught up in her own experiences when visiting new places. She would snap pictures of famous landmarks, enjoy the beauty around her, but she had never truly understood the importance of those places to the people who lived there. She had taken them for granted, thinking of them only as pretty backdrops to her own story. But now she saw that there was so much more, so many untold stories hidden in every corner, in every person, and in every tradition. Her thoughts turned to the guard once again. She wondered how he felt standing there every day, repeating the same routine, guarding the same castle. Did he ever get bored? Did he ever wish he could leave, see the world for himself? Or was he content, knowing that his role was essential in preserving something larger than himself? Julia couldn't imagine what it must be like to have that kind of responsibility, to be a living piece of history, someone whose every action was part of a much bigger picture. It made her think about her own life. She had always been a traveler, moving from place to place, never staying long enough to become part of anything. She had never had a role that was so important, so rooted in tradition and history. Her life had been full of experiences, but not many of them had felt truly significant. She often wondered what it would be like to have a purpose as clear and undeniable as the guard's. Julia stopped for a moment and leaned against a stone pillar, taking in the beauty of the castle. The views were breathtaking, with the majestic building rising against the blue sky, surrounded by lush green gardens and ancient trees. But her gaze wasn't just on the scenery anymore. Her thoughts were focused on the lessons she had learned. It wasn't just about being in the right place at the right time or taking the perfect photo. It was about understanding the deeper meaning of a place, of respecting the history and the people who had created it. As Julia continued her walk through the castle grounds, she thought about how little she had known about the culture before coming here. She had heard about the strictness of the king's guards, but she had never fully grasped why they were so revered. Now, after her encounter, she had a much clearer understanding. It wasn't just a matter of formality or obedience. It was about pride. It was about maintaining the dignity and honor of the kingdom, no matter the cost. The guard wasn't just standing there as part of a tradition. He was carrying the weight of his nation's history on his shoulders. Her steps grew slower, and the quiet reflection that had begun to settle in her mind deepened. Julia found herself not just admiring the beauty of the place, but appreciating the commitment of the people who had dedicated their lives to protecting and preserving it. She thought about how easy it was to overlook that commitment when you were just a visitor passing through. How many times had she taken something for granted, assuming it would always be there, without thinking about the people who worked tirelessly to make it possible? She realized how important it was to give credit to those whose dedication kept history alive. By now, the day was beginning to draw to a close, and the castle grounds were starting to empty out as the last group of tourists made their way to the exit. Julia decided to stay for a little longer, hoping to reflect on the things she had learned in peace. She walked toward a small bench that overlooked the gardens and sat down, letting the quiet wash over her. The sounds of the city had faded into the background, leaving just the soft rustle of leaves and the distant hum of the castle's walls. As she sat there, she thought about the guard again. She realized that she hadn't yet fully processed the lesson he had unintentionally taught her. It wasn't just about standing in silence or following orders. It was about embodying something much larger than yourself. It was about being part of a legacy, of knowing that your actions, however small they might seem, were part of a greater purpose. The guard wasn't there for the tourists. He wasn't standing on display for the cameras or the crowds. He was there because he believed in something bigger, something that had been passed down to him, and to all those before him, through generations. For the first time during her trip, Julia felt a sense of connection. not to the castle or the buildings, but to the people who had worked to preserve them. She understood now that the most important stories were not the ones found in guidebooks, but the ones carried by the people who lived in those places. The tour guides, the workers, the guards, they were the true keepers of history. Without them, there would be no stories to tell, no memories to preserve. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the castle walls, Julia stood up from the bench. She felt at peace, but also deeply moved by everything she had learned. She realized that her journey had just begun, not just in terms of travel, but in understanding the true essence of the places she visited. It wasn't about capturing the perfect moment or collecting souvenirs. It was about understanding the deeper significance of the places she explored, about honoring the people who had come before her and those who were keeping their traditions alive. Julia took a final look at the guard, who was still standing at attention, and smiled to herself. She had learned so much from that simple encounter, and she was grateful for the lesson. With a renewed sense of respect and understanding, she walked toward the exit, her heart a little fuller than it had been when she entered. This wasn't just a day of sightseeing, it was a day of personal growth. Julia knew now that every place had its own story to tell, and it was up to her to listen. The castle gates slowly began to close as the last of the tourists trickled out. Julia, however, stayed a little longer, taking in the peaceful atmosphere that had settled over the place. The hustle and bustle of the morning had faded away, replaced by the quiet hum of the evening. She stood in front of the grand stone gates, still thinking about everything that had happened earlier with the guard. The sun was beginning to set, casting a soft golden light across the castle grounds. The long shadows stretched across the pathway, and the air felt cooler now, the warmth of the day giving way to a more comfortable evening chill. Julia closed her eyes for a moment, letting the tranquility of the scene wash over her. She felt more at ease now, less burdened by the tension that had surrounded her earlier. She had come to this country as a tourist, eager to see the sights and experience the history. But what she hadn't expected was the profound personal lesson she would learn. The encounter with the guard had turned out to be far more meaningful than she could have imagined. At first, she had felt embarrassed, confused, and even frustrated. But now, she saw things in a completely different light. It wasn't just about a misunderstanding or a simple mistake. It was about understanding the deeper cultural significance behind the traditions she had encountered. As Julia took a few steps closer to the castle, she noticed the way the stone walls seemed to glow in the fading light. They had stood there for centuries, silent witnesses to countless events, both joyful and sorrowful. The history of the place seemed to breathe life into the air around her. It wasn't just a building, it was a symbol of the country's strength, resilience, and pride. She thought again about the guard, who had stood so still and silent earlier in the day. He wasn't just performing a task, he was part of something far larger than himself. He represented the country's traditions, its history, and its values. Julia had learned that his duty wasn't about acting tough or rigid. It was about honoring the past and maintaining the integrity of the culture. The guard had shown her what it meant to stand firm in your role, to take pride in your responsibilities, and to uphold the traditions of those who came before you. With that realization, Julia felt a deep sense of respect for the people who worked tirelessly to preserve the history and culture of this place. The castle wasn't just a tourist destination, it was a living part of the nation's story. And the people who dedicated their lives to protecting it were the true heroes. They were the ones who ensured that the stories, the traditions, and the legacies of the past would live on for generations to come. Julia couldn't help but think about her own life. She had always been a traveler, someone who moved from place to place without ever really settling down. She had explored many countries, visited countless landmarks, and met many people. But in all her travels, she had never truly understood the significance of the places she visited. She had seen them as just that, places to be seen, photographed, and then moved on from. But now, after her experience with the guard, she realized how much more there was to understand. Every place had its own story, and every person who was a part of it had a role to play in preserving that story. Julia took a deep breath and looked up at the castle one last time. The guard was still there, standing in his usual position, silent and still as ever. He had not moved a muscle since the incident, yet Julia now felt a quiet connection to him. She understood, in a way she hadn't before, the importance of his role. He wasn't just a figure in a uniform. He was a custodian of the past, a living symbol of everything that had come before. In his stillness, he preserved the dignity and honor of the kingdom. Her heart felt full as she stood there, watching the last rays of sunlight fade behind the castle walls. She realized that, in some ways, her encounter with the guard had been a turning point. It had opened her eyes to the deeper meanings behind the places she visited. No longer was she just a tourist snapping photos and checking off boxes. She was someone who had learned to look beyond the surface, to see the history and culture that lay hidden beneath. As the evening shadows grew longer, Julia finally turned away from the castle and made her way toward the exit. Her mind was clearer now, her thoughts more focused. She had learned a valuable lesson today, and it wasn't just about respect for the guard or the traditions he represented. It was about respect for everything she encountered on her travels. The people, the places, and the stories, they all mattered. They all played a part in the greater narrative of the world. And Julia had come to understand that it was her responsibility as a traveler to honor that narrative. She stepped out of the castle grounds and into the streets, where the city had come alive again in the evening light. The noise and energy of the crowd seemed louder now, but it didn't distract her. She walked with a new sense of awareness, a new understanding of the world around her. She saw the people on the streets with different eyes, no longer just faces in a crowd, but individuals with their own stories, their own histories. Julia knew that her journey had only just begun. She had learned so much from this experience, but she understood that there was still so much more to discover. There were countless other places, people, and cultures to explore, each with its own unique story to tell. And now, more than ever, Julia was eager to listen. She wasn't just passing through anymore. She was becoming part of the story. As she walked through the city, the feeling of connection lingered. She felt like a small part of a much larger world, a world full of stories waiting to be discovered. And for the first time, Julia was ready to hear them, not just as a tourist, but as someone who truly understood the value of what she was experiencing. The guard had taught her that the world was much more than just a series of destinations. It was a place where history, culture, and tradition were alive, and it was up to her to honor them. Julia smiled softly to herself. This was the kind of travel she had been seeking all along, meaningful, rich with understanding, and full of respect for the places and people she encountered. She didn't need to visit another monument or take another photo to feel complete. All she needed was to keep her eyes open, her heart receptive, and her mind eager to learn. She had found something far more valuable than any souvenir or picture could ever provide. She had found the true essence of travel,